July 2021. Gordon Knight is in a Michigan hospital and has been for 2 weeks. He is 92 years old. The nature of the illness was never made public in any detail, but 2 weeks is not an overnight observation. 2 weeks is serious. His daughter's wedding is 6 weeks away, 2,000 miles across the country, in Oregon. Amy had already gone to her followers in June asking them to pray for her father's health. She had said out loud what she was hoping for, which was that he would be well enough to be there. Nobody with a 92-year-old parent freshly out of a 2-week hospital stay books that flight with any confidence. He went anyway. On Saturday, August 28, 2021, at Roloff Farms in Hillsboro, Oregon, he walked her down the aisle. She was 58. He used a cane. He was smiling. 146 people watched him do it. It was the second time he had done it for her. The first was September 12, 1987, in Redford, Michigan. Amy was 24 and marrying a young software professional from California. 34 years between the two walks. Almost nobody gets to do that. Fathers get one, and most consider themselves fortunate to have made it that far. Gordon got 2, and he had to fight to be at the second one. The walks are the least of it. Look at who this man is. Born around 1929. Which puts his childhood squarely in the Depression and his adolescence in the Second World War. He built his adult life in the post-war boom, working for Ford Motor Company, one of the defining employers of 20th century America, and the one that essentially built the Detroit middle class he raised his family in. Patricia became his wife around 1952 or 1953. They were barely out of their teens. They stayed married until she died on September 24, 2019. Do that arithmetic. Roughly 67 years. 67 years is not a marriage, it is a geological formation. 4 children raised, the full passage, young parents, then grandparents, then great-grandparents. Every economic cycle from the 1950s through 2019. Her medical decline at the end, and him beside her for it. Whatever anyone thinks about the Roloff family's various marriages, Amy grew up watching that. It is worth knowing when you are trying to understand why she stayed in a difficult one for 29 years and why the second one was approached with such extraordinary caution. 67 years is also, in practical terms, an argument. It is the demonstration Amy grew up inside, proof that 2 people could stay, work it out, and be there at the end. That is not always a gift. A child who watches an unbreakable marriage may find it very hard to accept that her own is breaking. It sets a standard that has nothing to do with whether the standard is achievable. Amy stayed 29 years. She has been open about how difficult the ending was and how long it took her to accept it. Some portion of that is likely to be Gordon and Patricia, still married, still in Michigan, doing the things she could not manage. 4 children came out of that marriage. Katherine, Roger, Cyndi, who died in 2015, and Amy, the youngest. Amy was also the only one born with achondroplasia. Consider the position that put Gordon and Patricia in. It is 1962 in suburban Detroit. Their 4th child is born with a form of dwarfism neither of them has any experience of, in a decade with no internet, no support networks, and a medical establishment that was frequently unhelpful and occasionally worse. They had no map. Nobody handed them one. What Gordon did with that situation is the thing Amy has carried her entire life. And it came down to a sentence he said to her over and over across her childhood. God does not make mistakes. He said it when she came home from school having been treated badly. He said it when she was struggling with how she looked. He said it whenever the world had got at her and she needed something to set against it. She has built a career on that sentence. It is in her memoir, in her speaking work, and in the philosophy she markets under her own name. It came from a Ford employee in Michigan who had no training in any of this and simply decided what his daughter needed to hear. It is worth being precise about what that sentence claims because it is narrower and tougher than it sounds. It does not promise that anything will improve. It does not tell a bullied child that the bullying will stop or that there is a hidden purpose in it. Those are the versions of religious comfort that collapse the first time reality declines to cooperate. What it says is that the child herself is not in error. That is a much smaller claim, and it is very hard to disprove, which is exactly why it held for 60 years. Gordon almost certainly did not construct it that carefully. Fathers under pressure say the truest thing they have. He happened to have a good one. Now go back to 1987 and the first walk. Amy was 24. The wedding was in Redford, in the Detroit area where she had grown up, and her parents were at the center of organizing it. Gordon walked her down the aisle, handed her to Matt Roloff, and gave his blessing. He had no idea what he was giving her to. Nobody did. Matt was a young man with a job in computers and a plan. What was actually coming was Oregon, 109 acres, 4 children, a television show, a national profile, a great deal of money, and eventually a divorce. In 1987, Gordon was doing the ordinary thing that fathers do. The extraordinary part arrived much later. There is a detail in that first wedding worth registering. Gordon was giving his daughter away to a man he had met a handful of times. Amy has said she saw Matt 4 times before they married. If that is what she saw, her father saw less. He was standing in a church in Redford, handing over his youngest child to a near stranger from California, on the strength of her judgment and very little else. Some fathers would have made that difficult. Gordon did not. Whatever he privately thought about the pace of it in 1987, what he did in public was walk her down the aisle and give the marriage his blessing. That is a form of trust in a daughter that costs something. The decades in between were mostly the decades of any long-distance father-daughter relationship. Phone calls, visits when the calendar allowed, grandchildren met on trips out to Oregon, Amy going back to Michigan when she could. 2,000 miles is far enough to make casual contact impossible, and close enough that nobody has an excuse. Some markers stand out. In 2015, Amy's sister Cyndi died, which is a loss that reshapes a family and pulls the survivors closer. Gordon buried a child at 86, which is an order of events no parent is prepared for and which very few have to face at that age. In August of 2018, Gordon turned 90, and Amy flew back for it and posted photographs of the family gathered around him. 90 is a milestone people treat as an ending. It turned out to be closer to a midpoint of his final chapter than a conclusion. Then 2019 arrived and took a great deal. Patricia's health went into serious decline through the first half of that year. A bone infection, a weakening heart. Amy traveled to Michigan repeatedly. She kept her audience informed, which is what she has always done. And in doing so, she was slowly preparing them for something she was also preparing herself for. Patricia died on September 24, 2019, in a Michigan hospital with Gordon beside her. She was 86. 6 days earlier, Chris Marek had proposed to Amy. Patricia knew. She died knowing her youngest daughter was going to be all right, and Amy has spoken about that timing many times since with the kind of gratitude that does not need explaining. And Gordon, at 90, was suddenly a widower after 67 years. There is no preparing for that. A man who has woken up next to the same person since the Truman administration does not adjust to her absence. He endures it. There is a particular cruelty in the arithmetic of that autumn, and Amy has never quite said it out loud. Her mother's last weeks and her own new engagement occupied the same 6 days, joy and loss arriving in the same envelope, which is how it goes for most people in their 50s. Nobody gets the good news and the bad news in a sensible order. They come at once, and you carry both. Which brings us back to the summer of 2021, and why the second walk carries the weight it does. He was 92. He had buried his wife 2 years earlier. He had just spent a fortnight in hospital. His daughter was getting married in Oregon in 6 weeks and had already asked strangers on the internet to pray that he would be well enough to come. The reasonable decision was to stay home. 92-year-old men recovering from serious illness do not cross the continent for a weekend. Nobody would have thought less of him. Amy would have understood completely and told him so. He went. There is no record of anybody talking him into it, and there is no record of anybody talking him out of it either. He got himself on a plane, made the trip, arrived at a farm in Oregon, and on August 28th, he took his daughter's arm with his free hand and walked her the length of an aisle with a cane in the other. Think about the practical effort involved, because the sentiment tends to obscure it. A man of 92, 2 weeks out of a hospital bed, has to get from suburban Michigan to Hillsboro, Oregon. That is airports, security, a connection or a long flight, luggage, a hire car or a lift at the other end, unfamiliar accommodation, and a schedule set by somebody else. It is exhausting for a healthy person of 50. Then, having done all that, he had to stand up, walk a considerable distance in front of 146 people on uneven ground, and hold himself together during the most emotional 90 seconds of his daughter's year. He did not do the easy version either. He walked. There was no wheelchair, no shortened route, no substitute escort. Isabel Roloff shared the photographs afterwards. Guests who were there have described it as the most emotional part of the day, and at a wedding with an original song written for it and 146 people, that is saying something. Then at the reception, he stood up and led a toast. A father of the bride toast is not a small ask at any age. At 92, standing in front of a room, 6 weeks out of hospital, 2 years widowed, addressing your youngest daughter's second wedding, that is an act of will. What he actually said has not been widely reported. The fact that he stood up and said it is the part that matters. Something else made that day possible, and it happened 2 years before it. Before Chris Marek proposed, he asked Gordon Knight for his blessing. Old-fashioned. Most couples skip it now. Chris did not, and the reasoning is easy enough to reconstruct. He had worked out that Gordon was the foundation of who Amy is, and that honoring the father was the most direct available route to honoring the daughter. Gordon said yes. The proposal followed. The wedding followed that. The blessing came first. There is also the matter of what that day must have been for him privately, which nobody has asked him about and probably nobody should. He was watching his youngest daughter marry for the second time, 2 years after burying the woman he had married in 1953. Patricia should have been in that room. She had known about the engagement for 6 days before she died and had never met the wedding. A man in that position, standing to give a toast, is doing two things at once. One of them is visible in the photographs. The other one is not. Since 2021, Gordon has carried on being Gordon. Amy has flown to Michigan repeatedly. In August of 2022, and again in January of 2023, to mark what would have been Patricia's 90th birthday. She has brought siblings, cousins, and college friends along on some of those trips. And he still drives a 1991 Chevrolet Corvette, which he takes out when Amy is visiting. Hold that image for a second. A man in his mid-90s, behind the wheel of a 35-year-old sports car, with his 4'2" daughter in the passenger seat, somewhere in suburban Michigan. That is not a man in decline. That is a man who has decided he is not finished. The Corvette is a 1991, which makes it older than 3 of his grandchildren-in-law. He has presumably had it for decades. Men of that generation who bought a car like that in middle age and kept it did not do so as an investment. They did it because they wanted it. Amy has posted about the drives. There is no suggestion anybody is keen to have that conversation with him about handing over the keys. And on the available evidence, nobody has won an argument with Gordon Knight in some time. July 2025. Word went round online that Gordon Knight had died. Amy dealt with it immediately and publicly. Fake news, she said. Her father was alive and well, and she was in the middle of planning her next trip out to see him. She added something worth repeating. Do not let moments pass you by. Grab them when you can. That is a woman who has lost a mother and a sister, who is watching a father move through his mid-90s, and who knows precisely what the arithmetic is. 96 as of July 2025, and still the person his daughter phones, which means he was born closer to the First World War than to the year his daughter's television show premiered, and he has outlived the wife he married, one of his 4 children, and the entire 25-season run of the program that made his family famous. It is worth pausing on why those rumors spread at all. Gordon has never been a cast member. He appeared on the show rarely, gave no interviews, and has no public profile independent of being Amy's father. And yet enough people were tracking a 96-year-old retired Ford employee in Michigan that a false report of his death traveled. That is what 18 years of television does. It hands a private man an audience he never asked for, and then that audience starts speculating about his health. Amy's response was the correct one, quick, factual, and slightly irritated. Here is what the whole story amounts to. Gordon Knight has not done anything a biographer would call remarkable. He worked for a car company. He stayed married. He raised 4 children in a Detroit suburb. He is not famous, has never sought to be, and by every indication would prefer the whole thing had passed him by. What he did was show up, for something like 60 years, without interruption. He showed up when a small daughter came home upset and needed a sentence to hold on to. He showed up in Redford in 1987 to give her away to a man he barely knew. He showed up for a marriage that lasted 67 years and did not leave when it got hard at the end. He showed up in Oregon at 92, 6 weeks out of a hospital bed, to do a thing that took 90 seconds and that his daughter will remember for the rest of her life. Amy Roloff has been through a public divorce, a family fractured over a farm, and 18 years of strangers having opinions about her. She has come out of all of it recognizably herself. A significant part of the reason is standing in those wedding photographs, holding a cane. There is a version of this story that treats the second walk as the climax, and that is understandable. It photographs well and it makes people cry. But the walk took 90 seconds. The sentence took 60 years. Every time a small girl came home from a Michigan school having been treated as a curiosity, somebody was there to tell her she was not a mistake. Not once, at a crisis, but continuously, until she believed it well enough to keep believing it through a divorce, a family war over a farm, and 18 years of public scrutiny. You cannot photograph that. It does not make a wedding album. It is simply the daily, unremarkable, entirely unrecorded work of a father who kept turning up. The aisle walks are what people will remember. The sentence is what actually built her. Which moment hits harder, the second walk or the fact that he flew across the country at 92 to make it? Do you think Chris asking Gordon's blessing was the right call, or is that tradition better retired? And does knowing about 67 years change how you read Amy's 5-year wait before marrying again?